Good evening. It's Monday, August 10th. California Governor Gavin Newsom dodges questions on the resignation of a top state health official following a major glitch in coronavirus data collection. But he's clear on his response to President Trump's plan to require states to pay a quarter of a new $400 weekly federal unemployment benefit.
The state does not have an identified resource of $700 million per week that we haven't already obliged. There is no money sitting in the piggy bank of the previous CARES Act. It simply does not exist.
The U.S. surpasses 5 million reported cases of COVID-19. Brazil tops 100,000 deaths. The World Health Organization has a frank assessment on how the world is doing in battling the coronavirus.
This virus is proving exceptionally difficult to stop. It is brutal in its cruelty, but it doesn't have a brain. We have the brains. And I think Maria may outline how we can outsmart something that doesn't have a brain, but we're not doing such a great job right now.
Two House Democrats demand the resignation of the Postmaster General following what's being called a Friday night massacre, his ouster or reassignment of nearly 24 top postal executives. Lebanon's prime minister announces the resignation of his government following public outrage over the devastating explosion of ammonium nitrate at the port in Beirut, where it was stored under hazardous conditions for years. Hong Kong authorities arrest a pro-democracy media tycoon in the most far-reaching crackdown yet on press freedom.
We've seen that perhaps in third world cities and countries, but we never expected that would have happened in Hong Kong, but it did happen, causing direct and indirect threats to press freedom and journalists.
And a San Francisco judge orders Uber and Lyft to treat their California drivers as employees and not as independent contractors. From KPFA Berkeley and KPFK Los Angeles, this is the Pacifica Evening News. I'm Eileen Alfandary. California Governor Gavin Newsom announced today the state has caught up with a backlog of coronavirus case reports caused by a computer glitch that threw the state's COVID response into doubt. Newsom also suggested the surprise resignation of the state public health officer was appropriate, though he refused to give any details on her resignation. Newsom criticized President Trump's COVID relief executive orders as disappointing, saying the state can't kick in the extra funding that would be required. California has recorded more than 10,300 deaths from COVID-19 and more than 560,000 confirmed cases. Christopher Martinez reports.
It's been a troubling and in some ways chaotic last few days in California's struggle against the coronavirus pandemic. A computer glitch that left the state, in the words of one county health officer, flying blind. The Sunday night resignation of the top public health officer. And a congressional stalemate over COVID relief funding, leading to a new series of presidential executive orders. The data reporting glitch cast into doubt recent reports of progress in California's pandemic response. But Governor Gavin Newsom says over the weekend, the state has caught up with the backlog of 295,000 test results.
And I believe over the course of the next day or two, when we assess the total number of positives based on that backlog, that you will see exactly what we said was occurring a week ago. You'll see that reflected in the positivity rates in this state, that we're seeing a decline not just in hospitalizations and ICUs, but also in our positivity rates in the state.
There's widespread speculation that the reporting glitch was behind the sudden resignation of Dr. Sonia Angel, the state's health director and public health officer. Angel's brief resignation letter, released Sunday night, gave no reason for the resignation. Neither did Newsom.
Forgive me for being human here. I'm governor. The buck stops with me. You want accountability? It's with the state. It's with the governor.
Angel will be replaced by two people, one as public health officer and the other as state public health director. Nationwide, at least 48 state and local public health officers have been fired or resigned since April, according to reporting by the Kaiser Health News and Associated Press. In his Monday briefing, Newsom resisted repeated requests for more details on Angel's resignation.
She resigned. She wrote a resignation letter, and I accepted her resignation. We're all accountable in our respective roles for what happens underneath us. I don't want to err any more than that, but if it's not obvious, then I encourage you to consider the fact that we accepted the resignation, we appreciated her work.
Newsom also took the opportunity to criticize President Donald Trump's unemployment proposal. After Congress failed to renew a $600 boost to weekly unemployment payments, Trump issued an executive order to replace it with $400 a week. The catch? States would have to pay for a quarter of the cost. Newsom called the proposal disappointing, saying it does not meet the needs of states and cities.
The state does not have an identified resource of $700 million per week that we haven't already obliged. There is no money sitting in the piggy bank of the previous CARES Act to be reprioritized or reconstituted for this purpose. Simply does not exist. And for the state to absorb $700 million per week, potentially close to $3 billion per week, when, not if, the identified $70 billion fund the president is looking to draw down from would create a burn in the likes which even a state as large as California can never absorb.
Newsom rounded out the briefing with brief remarks on issues like philanthropic donations to the state's COVID response and comments about the importance of equity in coronavirus response. It's widely recognized that the COVID-19 pandemic is disproportionately affecting low-income communities of color. Newsom gave what he called a jaw-dropping statistic.
About 3/4 of renters in the state that have fallen behind in rent represented in the Latino and African American community, the Latinx and Black community, 62% of the Latino community, close to 10% in the Black community. So it underscores this lens of equity, issues of disparity. 3/4 of renters that have fallen behind in this category.
Now that the testing data glitch has been fixed, Newsom says corrected data on the last 2 weeks of coronavirus tests in California should be available in the next 2 or 3 days. Reporting for Pacifica Radio News KPFA, I'm Christopher Martinez.
John Swartzberg is a UC Berkeley clinical professor emeritus of epidemiology. He said the now corrected glitch that caused a lag in reporting California coronavirus test information may not have long-term consequences, but in the short term, it means state and local public health officials were deprived of key information in making decisions on policy issues like opening schools or businesses. Swartzberg appeared on KPFA's morning program Up Front with host Janine Eder, where he discussed how significant the glitch was.
And ultimately, we now know that this is about 300,000 results didn't get reported in a timely fashion. So that's over about 2.5 weeks or so. So that's a significant number. And where that becomes important is that a lot of the decisions the state is making are predicated upon a 7-day and 14-day rolling average of the number of positive cases and what's called our percent positive, the number of positive cases compared to the number of people tested. So if we're not getting a lot of the reports, that could alter significantly our results and make us think, for example, we're doing better than we really are. And we wouldn't want to be making decisions, for example, as Governor Newsom says, to dial up, that is, let more and more people do more and more things, predicated upon bad data.
John Swartzberg, I wanted to ask you really quickly about a possible new coronavirus saliva test that are close to being made available, as opposed to the nose and the throat swab forms of testing. In your estimation, how could a saliva test change things in terms of the battle with this disease?
Well, it makes it a lot easier to collect the specimen, first of all. There are no swabs that are needed. People don't have to stick swabs in your nose, or you don't have to stick a swab in your nose, which people are reluctant to do. And when people are doing it themselves, they often don't do it as thoroughly as they should be. Also, it eliminates the need for those swabs. And again, because of such poor public health planning in this country, swabs are one thing that are on short supply, which is absolutely crazy, but that's the case. So the saliva would obviate all those things. It would really make the next step, which is home testing, much easier to do. So I'm cautiously optimistic we're going to have those tests in the not too distant future.
John Swartzberg is a UC Berkeley clinical professor emeritus of epidemiology. You can hear the entire interview on this morning's edition of Upfront, archived online at kpfa.org. The World Health Organization, the WHO, warns COVID-19 infections are fast approaching 20 million worldwide. The WHO said strong leadership is needed to prevent new flare-ups and waves of the virus. Christina Onnested reports.
The World Health Organization's director, Dr. Tedros Adhanom, says global coronavirus infections are reaching a new high. But there's hope infections can slow down.
This week, we will reach 20 million registered cases of COVID-19 and 750,000 deaths. Behind these statistics, there is a great deal of pain and suffering. Every life lost matters. I know many of you are grieving and that this is a difficult moment for the world. But I want to be clear. There are green shoots of hope.
According to a tally from Reuters and the World COVID-19 stats, global coronavirus infections have already surpassed 20 million, with as many as 20.2 million cases and 737,000 deaths. But some nations are beating back the virus. Adhanom points to countries in the Mekong region, New Zealand, Rwanda, and island states across the Caribbean and Pacific that have been able to suppress the virus early on. Over the weekend, New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern announced 100 days with no community transmission. Adhanom says Rwanda is also an exemplary nation to suppress the pandemic.
Rwanda's progress is due to a similar combination of strong leadership, universal health coverage, well-supported health workers, and clear public health communications. All testing and treatment of COVID-19 is free in Rwanda, so there are no financial barriers to people getting tested. And when people test positive for the virus, they are isolated, and health workers then visit every potential contact and test them also. Getting the basics right provides a clear picture of where the virus is and the necessary targeted actions to save lives.
Adhanom says there are two essential elements to addressing the pandemic effectively. Leaders must step up to take action, and citizens need to embrace new measures. Other nations like France, Germany, the Republic of Korea, Spain, Italy, and the UK have had major outbreaks of the virus. But Adhanom says when they took action, they were able to suppress it. But in the U.S., which has the world's largest tally of coronavirus infections, now at 5.2 million, and 166,000 deaths, President Donald Trump has repeatedly said the coronavirus will simply go away. And his administration has resisted a nationwide COVID-19 response. But global health experts say the opposite should be done. Michael Ryan, executive director of the WHO's Health Emergencies Program, says the coronavirus needs to be actively suppressed.
This virus is proving exceptionally difficult to stop. It's difficult to recognize, it's difficult to distinguish between it and other syndromes unless you have adequate and immediate testing. You're seeing that now in countries with influenza and with COVID at the same time. So this is not an easy virus, and not an easy virus either to detect. It's not an easy virus to stop. Very often, viruses can show seasonal patterns. We've certainly seen that with influenza. This virus has demonstrated no seasonal pattern as such so far. What it has clearly demonstrated is if you take the pressure off the virus bounces back. And that's what we will say to countries in Europe. Keep the pressure on the virus. The DG said it. Suppress, suppress, suppress.
Another nation whose leader has flouted the severity of the coronavirus is Brazil, which over the weekend surpassed 100,000 reported coronavirus deaths. The South American country has the second highest coronavirus infections in the world, with more than 3 million reported cases. I'm Christina Onnested, reporting for KPFA.
President Trump was abruptly escorted by a U.S. Secret Service agent out of the White House briefing room as he was beginning a press briefing this afternoon. He returned minutes later saying there was a shooting outside the White House that was under control. Trump said he was escorted to the Oval Office by the agent. The White House was placed on lockdown following the incident. A District of Columbia Fire Department official said a man suffered serious or possibly critical injuries. Authorities were investigating whether the individual had a history of mental illness. This is the Pacifica Evening News on KPFA Berkeley, KPFK Los Angeles. I'm Eileen Alfandary. A new report says more than 97,000 children in the U.S. acquired new cases of COVID-19 in the 2-week period that ended at the end of July. That marked a 40% increase in cases among children. All told, more than 340,000 U.S. children have tested positive since the beginning of the pandemic. President Trump has falsely claimed children are almost immune from the virus. The survey was carried out by the American Academy of Pediatrics and the Children's Hospital Association. It came as school districts are grappling with whether to resume classroom instruction as schools get ready for the fall. Trump was asked about the report today. He doubled down on his insistence that schools reopen their classrooms.
It's a tiny fraction of death. Tiny fraction, and they get better very quickly. Yeah, they may have it for a short period of time, but as you know, the seriousness of it in terms of what it leads to is extraordinarily small. Very, very much less than 1%.
So do you still believe that children are essentially immune?
Yeah, I think that for the most part they do very well. I mean, they don't get very sick. They don't catch it easily. They don't get very sick. And according to the people that I've spoken to, they don't transport it or transfer it to other people, or certainly not very easily. So, yeah, I think schools have to open.
Although children are less likely to become severely ill, some have developed what's known as multisystem inflammatory syndrome. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention says in a new report of its own that children of color disproportionately fell ill with the syndrome. Of the 570 children reported with the illness, more than 40% were Latino, 33% were Black. The median age of children affected by the syndrome was 8 years old. 10 children reportedly died of the condition. Georgia's governor said today the reopening of some of the state's schools amid the coronavirus outbreak has gone well, except for photos shared on social media showing students crowded together in hallways. Photos shared widely on social media last week showed hallways packed shoulder to shoulder with students at North Paulding High School, northwest of Atlanta, many not wearing masks. School officials later announced 6 students and 3 staff members had tested positive, and that the school would be closed today and tomorrow while the building is disinfected. In nearby Cherokee County in Georgia, 12 students and 2 staff members from a dozen schools tested positive for the virus during their first week back at school. The Cherokee County school system reported that more than 250 students with potential exposure had been sent home to quarantine for 2 weeks. Cherokee County also drew attention because of online photos. Dozens of students at 2 of its high schools squeezed together for first day of school senior photos, none wearing masks. A veteran guard at San Quentin State Prison has died as a result of the coronavirus. It's the first COVID-19 death of an employee at San Quentin, where a large outbreak has infected staff and prisoners. Sergeant Gilbert Polanco was an Army veteran and a guard at San Quentin since 1988. He died after being hospitalized for more than a month. Of more than 260 staff members infected by the virus at San Quentin, Polanco was the first to die. At least 24 San Quentin prisoners have died from COVID-19. No signs of a breakthrough today in the impasse between President Trump and congressional Democrats over a massive federal coronavirus relief bill. President Trump tweeted that House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Senate Democratic Minority Leader Chuck Schumer wanted to meet to make a deal. Schumer, though, said there'd been no outreach on the Democrats' part since talks fell apart on Friday, and he called Trump's tweet, quote, fables from Donald Trump. On the Senate floor, Schumer took note of the nation's spiraling number of coronavirus cases to underscore the need for comprehensive relief.
Over the weekend, the United States achieved an ignominious milestone. 5 million Americans are confirmed to have contracted COVID-19, by far the most in the world. Our country went from 4 million Americans having had the disease to 5 million in 17 days, only 17 days. 1 million Americans were infected in just 17 days. We've lost American businesses, American wealth, and an unbearable number of American lives. So it should not be hard to convince Republicans in the Senate and the White House to provide urgent and necessary relief to the American people.
Over the weekend, Trump took unilateral action with a series of orders of questionable constitutional authority. He ordered an extension of federal unemployment benefits in the amount of $400 a week instead of the previous sum of $600. Trump then said states could apply for a waiver if they couldn't afford the 25% they would be required to put up. Trump's order would bar very low-income workers, those receiving less than $100 a week from state jobless aid, from receiving any of the federal funds. Trump also told employers they can defer collecting the employee portion of the payroll tax, although workers would be docked the money later. On evictions, Trump did not extend a federal moratorium that protected more than 12 million renters living in federally subsidized apartments or units with federally backed mortgages. Instead, he directed the Treasury and Housing and Urban Development Departments to identify funds to provide aid to those struggling to pay their monthly rent. Trump also extended a moratorium on student loans backed by the federal government. Republicans were cool at best to Trump's actions. Republican Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell ignored the initiatives when he made an afternoon speech on the Senate floor. McConnell instead chose to again castigate Democrats for proposing to aid state and local governments and to extend the full $600 federal unemployment benefit.
Democrats are saying nobody gets another dime of relief unless state and local governments get $1 trillion in extra money. Number two, the economists who calculated the likely COVID-related shortfalls for state and local governments have mostly produced estimates that are entire multiples less than what Democrats are demanding. Here's another one of those far-left demands. Nobody gets another dime unless we indefinitely pay people more to stay home than to go back to work.
Meantime, Trump today accused Republican Nebraska Senator Ben Sasse of being a rhino, a Republican in name only, who had gone rogue with his criticism of Trump's action. Sasse called Trump's executive orders unconstitutional slop. Scott Baba has more on the story.
While President Donald Trump said that his COVID relief executive order will provide economic aid to millions of Americans, critics say that his proposal is legally problematic, and even if it goes unchallenged, will be difficult to implement and is unlikely to deliver significant aid. Erwin Chemerinsky is the dean at the University of California, Berkeley School of Law. Chemerinsky said that the executive order is unconstitutional, as the power of the purse lies with Congress, not the president, and executive orders can only apply to how the executive branch administers itself.
The president doesn't have the power to do these things. With regard to extending unemployment benefits, that takes an act of Congress to do that. The president can't take money that's been appropriated for one thing and say, I want it spent something else. The president can't suspend the payroll tax. Congress gets to decide what the taxes are, whether to suspend them or whether to cancel them. Congress could use its power to regulate commerce among the states to create an eviction moratorium, but the president can't regulate landlords in that way.
Chemerinsky also said that the executive order does much less than what President Trump promised.
The eviction moratorium executive order actually just calls on the Department of Health and Human Services to investigate this. It doesn't really create an eviction moratorium. With regard to extending the unemployment funds, it depends on states coming up with a quarter of the money, and there's no apparatus for this to be done at all. With regard to the payroll tax, employers don't know what they're allowed to do in this regard. Employers, I think, are going to continue paying the payroll tax because there's no reason to believe the president has the authority to keep them from having to do so.
Maurice Emslem is a program director at the National Employment Law Project, an employment rights advocacy group. He said that the conditions laid out by the White House in the executive order made the $400 in federal unemployment benefits effectively inaccessible for many states.
It would provide $300 in federal funding only if the states can come up with $100 in funding to match the federal grant. Most states right now, probably all states, are in very rough shape, both in terms of their general funds and definitely in terms of their federal unemployment funds, given the unprecedented volume of unemployment claims. So that's just not feasible for most states to come up with that $100 for every worker for every week that folks collect this benefit.
The president's proposed unemployment bonus would come not from national unemployment funds, but out of federal disaster relief funds. Emslem said that because the money would not be coming through already existing channels, state unemployment departments would likely need to create an entirely new system to distribute the funds.
The state unemployment systems are basically crashing, or they're just trying to get back on their feet after this huge volume of claims. And they're struggling to deal with major backlog of claims. Almost 1 million claims here in California, for example, are still either in pending status or have not been paid. So struggling against significant odds to address that major backlog, keep up with these unprecedented volume of claims. And now they're expected to turn around and create a whole new program, which, imposes all sorts of IT and other technical challenges. And then at the same time, put all those other people on hold.
Emslem also noted that the language of the executive order seemed to target already vulnerable unemployment beneficiaries.
Another big concern is that if you are earning an unemployment check of less than $100, they expressly say those folks don't qualify for this benefit. So it's expressly targeting the lowest wage earners who receive less in unemployment benefits. And who are those folks? That's largely Black and brown workers, women, folks who are struggling to pay their bills and keep their families afloat.
Some critics point out that the fund being tapped is not large enough to supply the promised relief. The Center for Budget and Policy Priorities is a progressive public policy think tank in Washington, D.C. In a statement, it argued that, quote, even if every state could find new money to cover 25% of these unemployment benefit costs, the benefits apparently would run out after about 6 weeks. The presidential directive calls for using up to $44 billion in Federal Emergency Management Agency funds for the 75% of costs that the federal government would cover, an amount that would be exhausted sometime in September. I'm Scott Baba, Pacifica Radio, KPFA.
California tenants' rights advocates warn that come August 14th, 4 million Californians will face the risk of eviction when the courts reopen. San Francisco Assemblymember David Chu has authored a bill which advocates say is the last bill alive in the legislature that could prevent the crisis. It provides relief for renters, landlords, and homeowners by ensuring no family can be evicted on the basis of unpaid rent during the pandemic, and ensures homeowners with lost income receive forbearance. A new national report shows that up to 40 million people could be evicted from their homes by the end of the year as they suffer the effects of the coronavirus-induced recession. Ross Brown reports.
About 1/3 of all Americans rent their homes, and a new report from the Aspen Institute shows the pandemic-related unemployment crisis could mean eviction for more than 40% of those households without additional relief measures. Nevada is behind only Alabama, where renters are the most vulnerable to eviction. Other top states for vulnerable renters include Oklahoma, Louisiana, and New York. Study co-author Sam Gilman says the loss of housing often ushers in serious legal consequences and suffering for families.
It leads to children not being able to go to school, homelessness, depression, and diseases of despair. An eviction upends everything in a family's life.
Nevada has created a rent relief program, but the state's $30 million in assistance relies entirely on federal funds, and stimulus talks have stalled in Congress. President Donald Trump circumvented Congress on Saturday by signing executive orders he says will deliver aid to Americans, including an eviction moratorium, but it's not clear if they're constitutional or substantive. The report shows that 37% of Nevada renters are at risk of eviction by the end of the year if conditions don't change. Gilman says some renters will be able to borrow money or work something out with their landlord, but eventually those options will be exhausted.
And at that point, that's when this pick your natural disaster metaphor, eviction, avalanche, tsunami, tornado will continue to start tearing through and accelerating through our communities.
According to Gilman, it's not just renters who will be affected, but also landlords.
Those mom and pop landlords are also severely at risk in this rental housing crisis because if the renters can't pay rent, the landlords can't pay their mortgages, and we could see the acceleration of a rental housing crisis into a foreclosure crisis.
Gilman notes that Black and Latino Americans who already experience a greater risk of COVID-19 make up about 80% of those facing eviction. For Public News Service, I'm Roz Brown.
Puerto Rico was forced to partially suspend voting for primaries marred by a lack of ballots. Officials called on the president of the territory's elections commission to resign. The commission said primaries for voting centers that hadn't received ballots by yesterday afternoon were expected to be rescheduled. The American Civil Liberties Union filed a lawsuit on behalf of at least one voter. Minnesota officials say they've experienced a surge in absentee and early voting ahead of tomorrow's primary. Congresswoman Ilhan Omar is facing a well-funded challenge from a mediator and attorney who accuses Omar of being more concerned with her national image than serving her district's needs. Omar counted that she was targeted by powerful interests because of her progressive advocacy. Connecticut, Vermont, and Wisconsin also have state primaries tomorrow. Georgia and South Dakota hold state runoffs. Lily Volke reports.
It's Wisconsin's second chance to get a COVID election right. In April, the presidential primary and Supreme Court election were riddled with issues. Common Cause Wisconsin's Jay Heck remembers.
That the post office was to some degree overwhelmed, and we also saw cases where absentee ballots in bags of them, were left in post offices in various municipalities around Wisconsin that never got to the election clerks.
But in what some are calling another, quote, Friday night massacre, unquote, Trump-appointed Postmaster General Louis DeJoy announced a major shakeup. 23 executives were reassigned, including the two top people in charge of day-to-day operations. This follows cuts DeJoy says are aimed at saving money. Letter carriers are directed to leave mail behind if necessary to keep a tight schedule. Carriers are worried that changes will cause further delays this November.
None of this is helped by a president who's attacking voting by mail on a regular basis and throwing the legitimacy of the election into question even before it happened.
Steve Hutkins, retired NYU professor, runs a website called Save the Post Office. Study after study has shown vote by mail is reliable and secure. Hutkins worries Trump's repeated attacks could succeed in wearing away people's trust. From Pacifica Network and Public News Service, I'm Lily Bolke.
Two House Democrats are demanding the removal of Postmaster General Louis DeJoy. They cite his actions Friday, removing top post office officials and previously ordered changes that have undermined the agency's efficiency. A statement over the weekend by Oregon Democratic Representative Peter DeFazio accuses DeJoy of doing the president's bidding by sabotaging mail delivery with the November election less than 90 days away. North Carolina Congresswoman Alma Adams said DeJoy was unconstitutionally sabotaging the Postal Service with complete disregard for the institution's promise of the safe and speedy transit of the mail and the prompt delivery of its contents. Adams added that, quote, "My friend Maya Angelou used to say, when someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time." DeJoy is a major Republican donor to President Trump and has millions invested in private competitors to the Postal Service. This is the Pacifica Evening News on KPFA Berkeley, KPFK Los Angeles, KFCF Fresno. This newscast airs each weeknight at 6. Still to come on the news tonight, Hong Kong authorities arrest a pro-democracy media tycoon in the most far-reaching crackdown yet on press freedom. And a San Francisco judge orders Uber and Lyft must treat their California drivers as employees and not as independent contractors. A natural gas explosion leveled 3 row houses in Baltimore, killing one woman and trapping other residents. At least 6 people were seriously injured. A 4th row house was ripped open by the blast. The Baltimore Gas and Electric Company was called in to shut off gas around the immediate vicinity as rescuers were painstakingly going through the wreckage as night fell. The cause of the explosion wasn't immediately clear, but leaky pipes are a growing problem in Baltimore. The Baltimore Sun reported last year that dangerous gas leaks have become much more frequent, with nearly 24 discovered each day on average. The Baltimore Gas and Electric Company has thousands of miles of obsolete pipes that need to be replaced, an effort the newspaper said could cost nearly $1 billion and take 2 decades. Lebanon's prime minister has resigned in the wake of the catastrophic explosion in Beirut that has triggered public outrage. Prime Minister Hassan Diab said he had come to the conclusion that corruption in the country is bigger than the state. His remarks appeared on Al Jazeera.
At this particular moment, we have to go back to the people, to fight with them against corruption. We need to open the door to national salvage, national rescue. We need to be part of the people. So I declare today the resignation of this government. God bless Lebanon.
Lebanon's president accepted his resignation but asked the prime minister to stay on in a caretaker position until a new government can be formed. The ruling oligarchy has held onto power a long time, since the end of the Civil War in 1990. That will make it difficult to find a credible political figure untainted by previous connections to it. Yesterday, world leaders and international organizations pledged nearly $300 million in emergency humanitarian aid to Beirut, but they warned no money for rebuilding Beirut would be made available until Lebanese authorities committed themselves to the political and economic reforms demanded by the population. The United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres underlined the need for reform.
It is important that a credible and transparent investigation determine the cause of the explosion and bring about the accountability demanded by the Lebanese people. It is also important that reforms be implemented so as to address the needs of the Lebanese people for the longer term.
On the streets, protesters again clashed with police, who fired tear gas at them. The protesters were enraged by reports that more than 2,700 tons of ammonium nitrate were stored at the port for 6 years, despite the extreme dangers posed by the material. More than 150 people died, thousands were wounded, and an estimated 300,000 left homeless in the explosion. Simon Marks of Feature Story News reports.
It's estimated the blast caused by the unsafe storage of thousands of tons of ammonium nitrate created at least $15 billion worth of damage. In addition, of course, to the more than 150 lives lost and the thousands of people injured or made homeless. Jonathan Broder, a contributing editor for Newsweek, writes regularly about the Middle East and says the protests underway in Lebanon have been a long time in coming.
They signify the culmination of decades of corruption, of protest against corruption that has driven one of the Middle East's most spirited countries to ruin. I mean, the destruction, the losses of billions of dollars worth of damage are going to compound Lebanon's, I would say, multiple humanitarian catastrophes. I mean, its people are seething with rage as they're pushed deeper into poverty and despair by this accident that appears to have been completely avoidable.
Tomorrow, corruption in Beirut. What does it look like and how hard will it prove to overcome? With FSN Spotlight, I'm Simon Marks.
Hong Kong authorities arrested media tycoon Jimmy Lai. It was the most far-reaching crackdown yet on press freedom in Hong Kong under the auspices of a new national security law. A Hong Kong security official announced the arrest.
This morning at around 9:45, together with our colleagues from the Criminal Investigation Department and military staff, we got a warrant to conduct an operation to search for evidence.
The arrest of Lai, 2 of his sons, and several company officers and the search of the Next Digital headquarters marked the first time the national security law was used against the news media. Next Digital operates Apple Daily, a pro-democracy tabloid that often condemns China's government. Last month, Apple Daily condemned the new national security law on its front page, calling it the nail in the coffin for the one country, two systems framework, under which Hong Kong was able to enjoy much greater civil liberties than in mainland China. In May, shortly after China announced its intention to pass the national security law for Hong Kong, Lai condemned the legislation in a series of tweets. The state-owned newspaper Global Times called those tweets evidence of subversion. Pro-democracy lawmaker Emily Lau told Al Jazeera that the arrests and the crackdown were very disturbing.
Many are shocked and horrified, including myself. And I think this is sent out a very, very negative message. And of course, it must have a chilling effect on people who want to speak out, and particularly on the news media. So this is a very, very disturbing development.
The arrest came on the same day China announced sanctions on 6 members of the U.S. Congress and 5 others in retaliation for Friday's U.S. sanctions on Hong Kong and mainland officials. Nick Harper has that part of the story.
Beijing said this was a tit-for-tat response, citing those wrong U.S. behaviors, namely Washington's decision on Friday to blacklist 11 Chinese nationals, including Hong Kong's chief executive, Carrie Lam. It surrounds Beijing's decision to impose a new national security law on Hong Kong, which the U.S. says stifles democracy and Hong Kong's autonomy. It's another blow to U.S.-China relations, which have been deteriorating for months. The latest sanctions against the U.S. senators and others comes as police in Hong Kong arrested business tycoon and pro-democracy supporter Jimmy Lai. I'm Nick Harper in Washington.
Health and Human Services Secretary Alex Azar became the highest-ranking U.S. official to visit Taiwan since 1979. His visit part of the escalating battle between the U.S. and China over technology, security, trade, and human rights. Sarah Walton reports.
Health and Human Services Secretary Alex Azar is the highest-ranking member of the U.S. government to visit Taiwan for decades. On Monday, he met with President Tsai Ing-wen to discuss the country's response to COVID-19. Taiwan has recorded just 7 deaths from the virus. But Beijing has opposed the trip and urged the U.S. to respect what it called its one China policy. It sees the island as its sovereign territory. America has no formal diplomatic links with Taiwan, but does say it has close relations, as set out in the 1979 Taiwan Relations Act. I'm Sarah Walton in New York.
Thousands of people protested in Belarus for a second straight night after official results from weekend elections gave an overwhelming victory to authoritarian President Alexander Lukashenko. He has already ruled for 26 years. The president warned he'll crack down with full force on protesters. Dozens were injured and thousands detained hours after Sunday's vote, when police brutally broke up crowds of mostly young demonstrators. Dan Ashby reports for Feature Story News.
It's the most pivotal moment for this European country in a quarter century. Lukashenko, dubbed by Washington as Europe's last dictator, has won a landslide. But the result's credibility is in tatters. Belarus has not achieved free and fair election status in 25 years. And this time, opposition candidates were thrown in prison and more than 1,000 people were arrested ahead of the vote. Sunday night saw streets fill with huge crowds of peaceful protesters who were pummeled with stun grenades and water cannons. The question now is whether this is anger that Lukashenko can control or the start of mass protests that will shake his 26-year rule. Dan Ashby, Moscow.
Election officials said Lukashenko won a 6th term in office with 80% of the vote, while opposition challenger Svetlana Tikhanovskaya got 10%. Tikhanovskaya submitted a formal request for a recount to the Central Election Commission. Her remarks appeared on Al Jazeera.
We don't agree with the election results. We have absolutely opposite information. We have official protocols from many poll stations where a number of votes in my favor are many more times than for other candidates. We're gathering proofs of falsifications. We have people who are officially ready to confirm falsifications at poll stations. So we are starting to actively work on this, and right now I'm going to the Central Election Commission to say that we don't accept results of the elections.
Tiskanskaya is a 37-year-old former English teacher without any prior political experience. She entered the race after her husband, an opposition blogger who had hoped to run for president himself, was arrested in May. She has managed to unite fractured opposition groups and draw tens of thousands to her campaign rallies. They have been the largest opposition demonstrations since the collapse of the Soviet Union. This is the Pacifica Evening News on KPFA Berkeley, KPFK Los Angeles. I'm Eileen Alfandary.
Hey everyone, this is Brian Edwards-Teekert.
And I'm Kat Brooks.
Weekday mornings we host Upfront.
2 hours of conversation about what's in the news and what should be.
Politics, technology.
Prisons, police.
What's happening in City Hall and at the State House.
In Washington and in the streets.
That's starting at 7 a.m. right after Democracy Now!
On Upfront.
A San Francisco judge has ruled that Uber and Lyft must classify their drivers as employees and not as independent contractors. The preliminary injunction applies while litigation in the case continues. The judge, though, did order a stay for 10 days to give the companies time to appeal. California Attorney General Javier Becerra and the city attorneys for Los Angeles, San Diego, and San Francisco had filed suit. They said Uber's and Lyft's misclassification of drivers causes immediate and irreparable harm to the state and deprives workers of critical workplace protection. The lawsuit said Uber and Lyft were violating the provisions of a law, AB 5, that took effect in January. The two rideshare giants and DoorDash are spending tens of millions of dollars on a November ballot initiative to overturn the provisions of AB 5. Nagasaki marked yesterday's 75th anniversary of the U.S. dropping an atomic bomb on the city, with the mayor and the dwindling number of survivors urging world leaders to do more for a nuclear weapons ban. At the event at Nagasaki Peace Park, Mayor Tomisa Taue read a peace declaration in which he raised concern that nuclear states had in recent years retreated from disarmament efforts. The mayor singled out the U.S. and Russia for increasing risks by scrapping the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Force Treaty and said the threat of nuclear weapons being used is becoming increasingly real. That's an assessment shared by Jackie Cabasso, executive director of the Western States Legal Foundation. She appeared on KPFA's Sunday Show with Philip Muldery.
Even though the numbers of nuclear weapons have come way down, all of the nuclear-armed states are engaged in programs to modernize, quote-unquote. That sounds like making them better. It means making them more effective, more usable, have more military options, and so on, led by the United States, of course. And there are increased levels of military exercises, including nuclear drills. There are ongoing missile tests. In fact, on August 4th, the United States tested an intercontinental ballistic missile from Vandenberg Air Force Base, which they do about 4 times a year, unarmed. But for the first time in many years, this one was armed with 3 warheads. Sorry, MIRVed, in other words. And the United States currently does not deploy multiple-headed warheads, multiple-headed missiles, I should say. And so this is seen as a direct threat to Russia that if the United States indeed does not renew the START treaty as is unfortunately anticipated, it will go back to deploying these MIRVed missiles. So basically we have a new arms race going on among the nuclear-armed states. And also there is a growing number of close encounters between military forces of the U.S. and Russia, the U.S. and China, India and Pakistan, all of the nuclear-armed states. So really, we're living in a tinderbox situation.
You brought back memories from my deep past. 50 years ago, I participated in demonstrations at MIT in Cambridge, Mass. Against MIRV. MIRV stands for Multiple Independently Targeted Reentry Vehicles.
Right.
It means that one missile can have a plethora of individual bombs that can go and hit many independently targeted targets.
Right.
It means that it makes them all the more lethal and consequently impossible for those on the receiving end to actually counter it with an anti-missile shield of some kind. Or is that true?
Basically, that's true, and this is another example of the undoing of arms control. We've had a series of, the United States has now withdrawn from or abrogated a series of treaties and agreements, beginning with the withdrawing from the Intermediate Nuclear Range Forces Treaty at the beginning of this year, then the Open Skies Treaty, of course, abrogating, not withdrawing from, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which is the Iran deal. And now there's just one arms control treaty between the U.S. and Russia that still exists, which is the START Treaty, which is set to expire in February unless the U.S. and Russia agree to extend it by 5 years. And the U.S. is strongly signaling that it's not going to do that. This is one of those signals. So we have the undoing of arms control, and we have arms racing now at a level we haven't seen before.
Jackie Cabasso is executive director of the Western States Legal Foundation. She appeared on KPFA's Sunday Show with Philip Muldery. Urgent efforts are underway in the island nation of Mauritius to empty a stranded and leaking Japanese ship, which is carrying an estimated 2,500 tons of oil, before the vessel breaks up. Already more than 1,000 tons of black oil sludge has washed up on the eastern coast of Mauritius, polluting its coral reefs, protected lagoons, and shoreline. Ruben Pillay operates a virtual tour website of Mauritius.
The oil trail is right next to an island called Île aux Écrêtes, which is a natural reserve with endemic and endangered species there. There's the pink pigeon, there's giant tortoises. There's a tree there that's said to be 400 years old. But for the local people, it's been terrible. These people, they are fishermen, they are boat operators, they are divers. They live from the sea and they eat from the sea.
High winds and waves were pounding the ship. Experts fear it will split apart and dump its remaining cargo of oil into the waters surrounding Mauritius. The bulk carrier ran aground on a coral reef 2 weeks ago. Most Mississippi legislators wore masks and practiced social distancing when they returned to the state capitol today for the first time since the start of the largest coronavirus outbreak in any state house in the country. The state health officer, Dr. Thomas Dobbs, said that 49 Mississippi legislators tested positive for the virus. That's more than 25% of them. At least 4 lawmakers were hospitalized, 3 in the intensive care unit. At least 12 other people who work at the Capitol tested positive. 1 of them died. Mississippi lawmakers left the state capitol on July 1st after working there throughout the month of June. Many wore no masks. They didn't follow social distancing recommendations. Crowded elevators were common, as were gatherings in which unmasked people leaned close in to talk to one another. The state's Republican Governor Reeves only last week issued a statewide order in Mississippi for people to wear facial coverings in public. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has called it a moral duty to return children to classrooms next month. Schools in Britain closed in late March after the pandemic took hold, but some parents have said they're not convinced it will be safe to send their children back to school. Holly Hudson reports for Feature Story News.
Boris Johnson has made it very clear he's determined to reopen schools fully next month. Visiting one on Monday, he said in the event of having to reimpose restrictions, the last thing they want to do is close schools, adding that education is the priority. But teachers, scientists, opposition politicians and even the Children's Commissioner for England are among those calling for improvements to testing before pupils return. Unions are also urging that students be taught on a 1 week on, 1 week off basis if there was a resurgence of COVID-19. But the government claim that there is little evidence of coronavirus being transmitted in schools. Holly Hudson, London.
Residents and visitors in Paris are now required to wear face masks in some outdoor areas of the French capital amid a rise in reported coronavirus cases. French police are authorized to issue a fine equivalent to $159 to people who don't follow the new public health requirements. French health authorities on Friday reported more than 2,000 new confirmed cases, the biggest single-day count since May. Russ Collin reports.
The latest figures from the French public health authorities show an increase in the incidence rate of COVID-19 of 33% for the first week of August compared to the previous 7 days. Paris has stopped short of imposing the compulsory face mask measure across the entire city, but from Monday it will be obligatory to wear one in the most crowded outdoor spaces, such as along the banks of the River Seine and around the popular Montmartre and Sacré-Cœur Cathedral area. Ross Cullen, Paris.
A California church held indoor worship services yesterday despite a judge's temporary restraining order that bars the church from doing so. The pastor led 3 services in defiance of coronavirus health orders at Godspeed Calvary Chapel in Ventura County's Newberry Park. Live streams of the services showed a maskless pastor and a musician and standing congregants. The first service showed at least 24 worshipers, most of whom were also not wearing masks. A group of protesters gathered outside the church. The pastor said he hadn't been issued a citation for performing the services in violation of the judge's order, at least not yet. Lawyers for President Trump are making a final pitch to block the release of his tax records for a prosecutor's criminal probe. The lawyers said in court papers filed in federal court that Manhattan District Attorney acted in a retaliatory manner when he subpoenaed Trump's accountant for nearly a decade of tax returns. They said District Attorney Cyrus Vance Jr. was on a fishing expedition for a wide swath of financial documents only after the Trump Organization questioned documents Vance requested from it. That request pertained to documents related to payments that Trump's former personal attorney and fixer, Michael Cohen, arranged in 2016 for 2 women who claimed affairs with Trump. President Trump tweeted today that his August 27th acceptance speech for the Republican presidential nomination will be held at either the White House or the Gettysburg battlefield. Both sites are federal property and raise legal and ethical issues for their use in a political event. Within the Democratic Party, there's some tension about how soon before the Democratic National Convention Joe Biden should unveil his vice presidential pick. While finalists and their allies believe the process has already gone on too long, some Democratic operatives want Biden to wait as long as possible before the convention's August 17th start date to limit the vice presidential nominee's exposure to the attacks expected no matter whom he picks. A rare storm packing 100-mile-per-hour winds and with power similar to an inland hurricane swept across the Midwest today. The storm, known as a derecho, toppled trees and flipped vehicles as it tore from eastern Nebraska across Iowa and parts of Wisconsin and Illinois. Several people were injured. It caused widespread property damage and left hundreds of thousands without power. Weather forecast for the San Francisco Bay Area, mostly cloudy tomorrow morning, then sunny. Highs in the 70s around the Bay to the lower 80s well inland. In Los Angeles, sunny after morning, low clouds and fog. Highs from the lower to mid-70s at the beaches, the lower to mid-80s inland. In Fresno and the central San Joaquin Valley, sunny with a high of 102 degrees. Thanks for joining us on the news tonight, and a very big thank you to those of you who made a donation during our summer fund drive. We met and actually surpassed our goal of $300,000. Janine Eder is at the controls and produced recorded portions. I'm Eileen Alfandary.
This is a community announcement for August 2020. The dynamic Miss Faye Carroll offers an East Bay one-day workshop on Saturday, August 22nd from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. The one-day workshop includes group singing, harmony, improvisation, games, and a chance to win exclusive Faye Carroll apparel. Face coverings and spatial distancing are mandatory. Space is limited. For details and to apply, contact Ms. Carroll at faycarrollbiz@gmail.com. This community announcement is produced by the First Voice Apprenticeship Program. Please send your event for consideration to calendar@kpfa.org. You can hear this announcement again at 848-6767, extension 621, or view it online at kpfa.org.
This evening on Afro